They're not yours.
Then why does my dog already know them?
Rex down. The leash tore loose before the handler could stop it, and 80 pounds of muscle and fur came flying straight at two 6-year-old boys standing beside their mother. She didn't think. She stepped in front of them, arms out, bracing for teeth. But the dog didn't attack. It skidded to a stop, inches from the boys, dropped its head low, and made a sound no one standing there had ever heard a dog make before, somewhere between a whine and a cry, like it had found something it believed was lost forever. Animals don't lie. They don't know how to perform, and they don't know how to deny what's standing right in front of them. Only people do that. Her name was Betsy. 6 years earlier, she let a man believe she'd destroyed something she never touched. This is the story of how a lie that was supposed to protect her sons almost cost her everything, and how one dog's memory undid what 6 years of silence had built. Wherever you're watching this from, whatever the weather's doing outside your window right now, get comfortable. This is one you'll want to sit with until the end. But the story starts long before that afternoon in the market. Betsy was 23 when she met him. She wasn't looking for anyone, and she certainly wasn't looking for a man tied to a Korean crime family. But life rarely asks permission before it changes direction. Back then, she still believed simple things, that if you gave someone your whole heart, they'd protect it, that love was supposed to make a person braver, not smaller. She believed all of it, every hopeful piece of it, right up until the day it stopped being true. The dog noticed her before anyone else in that family did. Rex used to follow her from room to room whenever she visited, resting his head against her knee, refusing to settle unless she was somewhere in his sight. She used to joke that he liked her more than his own owner did. She had no idea yet how much that joke would end up mattering. What nobody told her, what she wouldn't understand until 6 years later, was that some of what a dog remembers, it never lets go of. Not after years apart. Not after an ocean of distance, not even after a lie had been sitting between two people like a locked door. 3 months into loving him, Betsy found out she was pregnant. She thought it was the beginning of something. She had no idea it was about to become the end of everything she thought she understood about the man she'd chosen. She would remember the exact words his mother used the day it all fell apart for the rest of her life. She would remember the silence that followed, worse than any shouting could have been, and she would remember, most of all, the moment he looked at her, the man she believed would choose her over anything, and said nothing at all, while his family decided her child's fate for him. That silence is where this story really begins. Betsy met him on a Tuesday, at a language exchange event she'd only gone to because a coworker begged her not to sit through it alone. His name was Do-yoon, and he didn't look like what she expected when someone told her, weeks later, exactly what his family did for a living. He looked like a man who paid attention. He remembered small details, the way she took her coffee, the fact that she got quiet whenever anyone raised their voice, the exact day her mother had passed 2 years earlier. For the first few months, none of the family business touched them. Do-yoon kept that part of his life in a separate room and didn't invite her in, and she didn't ask. She had her own life, a job at a design firm, a small apartment, a routine she'd built on her own after years of no one to build it with. He fit into the spaces around that routine without disrupting it. That was part of what made it feel safe. She met his mother 3 months in, at a dinner that Do-yoon had described as casual, and that turned out to be anything but. His mother, a composed woman named Youngja, studied Betsy the entire meal with an expression Betsy couldn't read yet. Later, Do-yoon told her that was just how his mother looked at everyone, and Betsy believed him because she wanted to. Rex was there for most of it, at the house, at family gatherings, curled at Betsy's feet during the long dinners where she understood maybe half the conversation. He'd rest his head on her knee under the table, and she'd slip him pieces of food when no one was looking, and Do-yoon would catch her doing it and grin like he'd caught her at something much bigger than that. He doesn't do that with everyone, Do-yoon told her once. He's particular about who he lets close. She didn't think much of it at the time. She had no reason to. What she didn't see, what she couldn't have seen, because it was happening in rooms she wasn't invited into, was the conversation Youngja was already having with her son. Quiet conversations over months about legacy and appearances and what a man in his position could and couldn't afford to build his life around. Do-yoon never brought those conversations home with him. He came back from them and acted like nothing had changed. And Betsy, trusting him the way she'd trusted very few people in her life, took the calm at face value. There was a night, maybe 5 months in, when Do-yoon sat across from her at her apartment and told her, without being asked, that he wanted a future with her. He wasn't a man who said things he didn't mean. She'd learned that about him early, in the small ways he kept promises other men would have forgotten making. She held on to that memory later, in the years after, the way you hold on to proof that something was real even after it stopped being true. The first crack came quietly. A dinner Do-yoon cancelled at the last minute, something in his voice that hadn't been there before. A visit to his mother's house that he asked her to skip just this once. Small things, the kind of things a person only recognizes as warnings when they're looking backward, already knowing how the story ends. Betsy didn't know yet that the ground underneath her was already shifting. She only knew that the man across from her still looked at her like she mattered, and for a little while longer, that was enough to keep her from asking questions she wasn't ready to hear the answers to. The pregnancy test sat on the edge of the sink for almost an hour before Betsy could make herself look at it a second time. 2 lines. She'd expected one, had prepared herself for one, and now she was staring at proof of something she hadn't planned for and couldn't undo. She told Do-yoon 3 days later, in her apartment, the same place he'd once told her he wanted a future with her. She watched his face change in real time, fear moving through it before anything else could. Not anger, not yet, just fear, plain and unguarded, the kind she hadn't seen on him before. "I need time," he said. "Just give me time to figure out how to tell them." She gave him a week, then 2. By the 3rd week, he stopped answering some of her calls, and the ones he did answer felt shorter than they used to, like he was rationing something. When he finally brought her to see his mother, it wasn't the conversation Betsy had imagined during those sleepless nights of preparing what to say. Youngja didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke in a tone that made it clear the outcome of this meeting had already been decided before Betsy walked through the door. "This family has a name to protect," Youngja said, in English, so there would be no confusion about who the words were for. "A child like this complicates things that cannot afford to be complicated." Betsy looked at Do-yoon, waiting for him to say something, anything, that put her on the same side of the room as him. He looked at the floor instead. 2 men Betsy didn't recognize were in the house that day, standing near the door, the way people stand when they're there, to make sure things go a certain way. Nobody introduced them, nobody needed to. It was Youngja who slid the envelope across the table, not Do-yoon. Inside was more money than Betsy had ever held in her life, enough to disappear on, enough to make clear this wasn't a suggestion. "You will end the pregnancy," Youngja said, "and you will not contact my son again." Betsy turned to Do-yoon one final time. She needed him to say no. She needed him to stand up, to remember the man who used to hold her face like it was something precious, to be that man now, when it actually cost him something. He said nothing. He kept his eyes on the floor, his jaw tight, his hands still, and let his mother's silence become his own. That was the moment something in Betsy went quiet, in a way it never fully recovered from. Not loud grief, not yet, just a door closing somewhere inside her, one she would spend years deciding whether to ever open again. She took the envelope, Not because she agreed to what was written on the terms attached to it, but because she understood, faster than anyone in that room expected her to, exactly what kind of family this was, and exactly what would happen to her and her child if she stayed and fought them on their own ground. She left the city 3 weeks later. She told the one friend who asked that she'd gone through with it, that it was over, that she didn't want to talk about it again. She let that lie travel back to Do-yoon through the few threads still connecting her old life to her new one, and she never corrected it. She did not end the pregnancy. She carried it in silence, in a city where no one from that old life would think to look for her. And she built a wall around that secret so complete that even she, some nights, almost believed the version of the story everyone else had settled on. Betsy gave birth alone, in a hospital 3 states away from anyone who knew her name before that year. Twin boys born 4 minutes apart, both of them arriving with a full head of hair and lungs strong enough that a nurse joked they'd already decided the room belonged to them. She named them herself, without asking anyone's permission, without a single conversation about family names or tradition. Elias and Micah, names that belonged to no one but her and them. The first 2 years were the hardest, though she rarely let herself use that word even in her own head. She worked 2 jobs for a while, then one that paid enough once she'd built a small reputation doing freelance design work she could do from home while the boys slept. She moved twice, each time a little further from anywhere Do-yoon's family might think to look, though as the years passed she began to understand that no one was looking. No one had ever planned to look. She did not hate him, not in the simple way people hate villains in stories. What she felt was harder to name, something that sat between grief and disbelief, a private disappointment in a version of him she'd built up in her mind that turned out not to exist outside of it. She kept one photograph from that time, tucked into a drawer she rarely opened, not out of longing, out of proof, mostly to herself, that the life she'd had before this one had actually been real. Do-yoon's life moved forward on a different track entirely. In the months after Betsy disappeared, his mother arranged introductions to women from families with the right connections, the right last names, the kind of alliances that mattered in a world built on obligation and appearance. He went along with it, the way a man goes along with a current he stopped fighting. He told himself more than once that he'd done what needed to be done, that Betsy had made her own choice when she took the money, that the pregnancy had ended the way these things sometimes had to end. He never asked to see proof. He never let himself wonder, even quietly, whether the story he'd been told was the one that had actually happened. Rex noticed it first, in the small ways dogs notice absences that people learn to talk themselves out of. For months after Betsy stopped coming around, Rex would wait by the door on the evenings she used to visit, ears up, refusing to settle until well past the hour she would have arrived. Do-yoon noticed the dog's behavior and said nothing about it to anyone, filing it away in the same part of his mind where he kept everything else he'd decided not to examine too closely. Youngja considered the matter closed. As far as she was concerned, a problem had been identified and handled, cleanly and permanently, exactly the way problems in that family were supposed to be handled. None of them knew that 4 states away, 2 boys were growing into features that would one day be impossible to explain away as coincidence. A particular set to the eyes, a way of tilting the head when concentrating, small physical inheritances that existed whether or not anyone in that family was prepared to see them. The lie held year after year because no one on either side had a reason to test it. Betsy built her life around protecting her sons from a family that had already shown her exactly what they were willing to do. Do-yoon built his life around a version of events that let him keep functioning inside a world he'd never had the courage to leave. It would take a dog's memory and one afternoon in a crowded market to put both versions of the story in the same room again. Do-yoon hadn't planned to be anywhere near that market that afternoon. Rex had needed walking, and the route his usual handler took passed through the open-air market 3 blocks from the house, the same route they'd walked 100 times without incident. Then Rex stopped mid-stride, lifted his head, and went still, in a way the handler had never seen him go still before. Before anyone could react, the leash was gone from the handler's hand, and the dog was moving, fast and certain, straight toward a woman standing with 2 boys near a fruit stand. Do-yoon arrived at a run, already calling the dog's name, already prepared to apologize to whoever the stranger was for the disruption. Then he saw her face, and every rehearsed apology in his head disappeared at once. 6 years had changed things about Betsy, but not enough that he didn't know her immediately. She looked, for a moment, exactly as frozen as he felt. Rex hadn't attacked anyone. He dropped low in front of the 2 boys, whining, refusing to move, behaving the way he used to behave in the months Betsy had spent visiting a house he was no longer welcome in. Do-yoon had seen this dog greet exactly one person that way in its entire life, and she was standing 3 feet in front of him now, one hand resting protectively on each boy's shoulder. He looked at the boys properly for the first time. 6 years old, by his fastest calculation, which put the timing somewhere he didn't want to let his mind finish walking toward. One of them had a way of tilting his head, listening, that Do-yoon recognized because he'd been told his entire life that he did the exact same thing. "They're not yours," Betsy said, before he'd asked anything. Her voice was steady in a way that told him she'd rehearsed this exact possibility more than once, somewhere in the years since she'd last seen him. "I ended it. You know I ended it." "Then why is my dog acting like he's known them his whole life?" Do-yoon asked. It wasn't an accusation. It came out quieter than that, closer to the voice of a man who already suspected the answer and was asking anyway, hoping to be told he was wrong. Betsy didn't answer right away. In the silence, Rex whined again and pressed his head against the smaller of the 2 boys. And the boy, confused but unafraid, reached out and rested a hand on the dog's head like he'd done it before, though he never had. "You don't get to ask me anything," Betsy finally said. "Not after what your family did, not after what you let." Betsy hadn't planned on being anywhere near that part of the city that day. She'd taken the boys to visit a cousin passing through for work, and the market had been a stop between the train station and lunch. Nothing more than a way to kill 20 minutes. She didn't know Do-yoon kept an apartment 3 blocks from there now, a fact that would only occur to her later, once the shock had worn thin enough to let ordinary thoughts back in. She didn't see him at first. She saw the dog. Rex had been out with a handler, one of the men Do-yoon's family kept around for tasks too small to do themselves, when something in the crowd made the dog stop walking altogether. Betsy would learn later that the handler tried to pull him along twice before Rex tore the leash out of his hand entirely. By the time she turned around, the dog was already at Elias and Micah's feet, refusing to move, making a sound low in his throat that didn't belong to any command he'd ever been trained to follow. Do-yoon arrived at a run less than a minute later, out of breath, already reaching for Rex's collar before he'd fully registered the 2 boys standing in front of the dog. He got a hand on the leash. He did not immediately look up. When he did, the first thing he saw was Betsy's face, older than the last time he'd seen it, but unmistakably hers. The second thing he saw was the 2 boys standing just behind her, watching the dog with the mild confusion of children who didn't understand why a stranger's pet had decided they were the most important thing in the market. Do-yoon didn't say anything for a long moment. Betsy didn't either. 6 years of silence between 2 people doesn't end with the right words arriving on command. It ends, usually, with neither person having any words at all. "They're not yours," Betsy said finally, because it was the only sentence she had ready, the one she'd rehearsed in her head every year on their birthday, just in case. Do-yoon looked at the boys again. Really looked, the way a person looks when some part of them already suspects what they're about to find and is trying to delay finding it anyway. Micah tilted his head at Rex. exactly the way Do-yoon tilted his own head when he was working something out, an expression so familiar that Do-yoon felt it land somewhere behind his ribs before his mind had caught up to what it meant. "How old are they?" he asked. His voice had gone quiet in a way Betsy hadn't heard from him since the day in his mother's house. "That's not your business," Betsy said, but her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, and Do-yoon heard it. He didn't press her there, in the middle of a crowded market, with his family's handler, standing close enough to overhear. But something had already shifted in him, a math he couldn't stop his mind from doing. 6 years, twin boys, a dog that had never in its life reacted to a stranger the way it was reacting to these two. He let Betsy walk away that day. He didn't chase her, didn't demand answers he wasn't yet ready to hear the real weight of. But he went home that night and sat with Rex for a long time, the dog's head resting against his knee the same way it used to rest against Betsy's, and he understood, with a certainty that made his chest feel hollowed out, that he had spent 6 years believing something that had never actually been true. The lie he'd built his life on top of was no longer holding, and he had no idea yet how much it was going to cost him to find out what had really happened underneath it. It took Do-yoon 3 days to find Betsy again. He hired someone quietly, someone outside his family's usual circle, because the last thing he wanted was for his mother to know he was looking before he understood what he was looking for. When he showed up at Betsy's apartment, she almost didn't let him in. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, the boy's voices audible somewhere behind her from another room, and told him he had 5 minutes. "I need to know," he said. "I need you to tell me the truth." "You already know the truth," Betsy said. "You just don't like the one you're finally seeing." She didn't invite him further inside that day, but she didn't lie to him either. Not anymore. She told him about the envelope, about the 2 men by the door, about the silence he'd let sit between them, while his mother decided the fate of a child he hadn't even met yet. She told him she'd taken the money because it was the only way out of that house that didn't involve fighting a family with more power than she had ever had access to. She told him she let everyone believe she'd gone through with it because it was the only story that kept her and her sons safe from a family that had already shown her what they were capable of deciding on someone else's behalf. Do-yoon didn't defend himself. There wasn't much left to defend. He requested a paternity test 2 days later, not because he doubted what his own eyes and Rex's reaction had already told him, but because he understood that nothing he said on his own would hold up against 6 years of a story his family had already accepted as settled. Betsy agreed to it, mostly for the boy's sake, so that whatever came next would rest on something firmer than a dog's memory and a stranger's guilty face in a market. The results confirmed what neither of them had needed confirming anymore. Word reached Youngja faster than Do-yoon wanted it to. She arrived at his apartment 2 nights later, and the conversation that followed was worse than anything Betsy had witnessed 6 years earlier, because this time there was no envelope that could make the problem disappear. The children existed, they had names, they had a birth certificate somewhere with blank spaces that could no longer stay blank if Do-yoon chose to claim them. "You will let this go quietly," Youngja told him, the way it should have ended the first time. "They're my sons," Do-yoon said, and it was the first time in his life he could remember saying a true thing to his mother that he knew she didn't want to hear. Youngja's response was not shouting, it was worse than shouting. She reminded him calmly of everything a public acknowledgement would cost, the arrangement with the family he was expected to align with, the reputation the organization had spent decades protecting, the version of his future she had already built for him without his full consent, twice now. Betsy, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle. Word of the paternity test had reached people connected to Do-yoon's world faster than she expected, and within days she noticed unfamiliar cars outside her apartment, phone calls that hung up the moment she answered. She understood with a fear that sat differently now than it had 6 years earlier, that acknowledging the truth hadn't made her sons safer. It had made them visible to a family that had already proven, once, what they were willing to do to protect themselves from complication. She thought about disappearing again. She got as far as pricing a plane ticket before she stopped herself, staring at her sons asleep in the next room, and asked herself how many more years she was willing to spend running from people who had never once had to answer for what they'd already taken from her. She decided, that night, that she wasn't running this time. Whatever came next, she was done doing this quietly. Do-yoon spent the better part of a week doing something he hadn't done since he was young enough to still believe it mattered, thinking through what kind of man he actually wanted to be, separate from what his family had spent his whole life deciding for him. He thought about the version of himself that had sat silent in his mother's house 6 years earlier, letting an envelope speak for him. He thought about Rex, refusing to leave 2 boys' side in a crowded market because some part of the dog had never stopped waiting for a piece of the family it had lost. He thought about Micah tilting his head the exact way Do-yoon did, a gesture passed down without either of them choosing it. He went to see Betsy again, this time asking before showing up, waiting on her porch until she came out to meet him, instead of pushing his way into her home. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I don't think I've earned the right to ask you that yet, but I want to be in their lives. Not quietly, not as a secret arrangement my family controls the terms of. Openly, whatever it costs." Betsy studied him for a long moment. She had spent 6 years building a life that didn't require anything from him, and some part of her wanted to tell him it was too late, that the door he'd let close back then didn't reopen just because his mother had run out of ways to make the problem disappear. But she also watched her sons, in the week since the market, ask questions about the dog, about the man who'd looked at them like he recognized something, questions she didn't have easy answers for anymore, now that the truth existed whether she voiced it or not. "If you do this," she said, "there's no version where you get to change your mind again." "Not this time, I know," he said. The harder conversation was the one he still had to have with his mother. Youngja gave him one final opportunity to walk away clean, a story already prepared, paperwork already drafted, a way to make the entire matter disappear from the family's record, the same way it had disappeared once before. All he had to do was sign it and let his sons stay what they'd always been to the organization, unofficial, unacknowledged, a complication resolved. Do-yoon sat with the paperwork in front of him longer than he expected to. Signing it meant safety, the kind of safety he understood intimately, the kind his entire life had been built around protecting. Not signing it meant stepping into territory his family had never allowed him to occupy, public, permanent, undeniable. He thought about the envelope from 6 years ago and the man who had let it speak for him. He didn't sign it. "I'm claiming them," he told his mother. "At the gathering, next month, in front of everyone." Youngja's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. The recognition that for the first time in his life, her son had made a decision she couldn't simply overrule with silence and money. "Then you understand what you're choosing to lose," she said. "I understand what I already lost once by not choosing them," Do-yoon said. "I'm not doing that again." The gathering was the kind of event Do-yoon's family held every year, an anniversary dinner for the organization's oldest allies, the sort of evening built entirely around appearances, where every seat at the table had been assigned for reasons that had nothing to do with who actually wanted to sit next to whom. Youngja had spent weeks preparing it, and for the first time in his life, Do-yoon understood that his mother's preparation was no longer working in his favor. He arrived with Betsy and the boys beside him, not hidden in a side room the way his mother had suggested, not introduced quietly to a handful of people who could be trusted to keep it contained. He walked them through the front entrance, past the tables of people who had known him his entire life, and did not let go of Elias's hand the entire way. The room noticed before anyone said a word, Conversations paused. Someone's glass stopped halfway to their mouth. Youngja, seated near the head table, went very still in a way that told Doyun she understood exactly what he'd chosen to do the moment she saw who was walking in beside him. He didn't wait for someone else to force the moment. He asked for a few minutes before the meal began, and though his mother's face made it clear she would have refused him if refusing wouldn't have made the scene worse, she said nothing as he took the floor. 6 years ago, he said, I was told I didn't have children. I let myself believe that because it was easier than facing what it would cost me to believe otherwise. He looked toward Betsy briefly, then back at the room. That wasn't true. These are my sons. I have the paternity results if anyone in this room needs to see them, though I don't imagine anyone actually will, once they look at them. A few people did look. It didn't take long for the resemblance to do what documents alone might not have. He didn't stop there. He laid out plainly and without raising his voice what had happened in his mother's house 6 years earlier. The envelope, the demand, the silence he'd let stand in for a decision he should have made himself. He didn't frame it as an accusation dressed up in politeness. He said it the way a man says something he's finally decided he's no longer willing to carry as a secret. Youngja tried, once, to redirect the room, to suggest this was a private family matter better discussed elsewhere. But the room had already heard enough, and among the older allies seated closest to the head table were several who valued loyalty and family duty above almost everything else the organization claimed to stand for, and a man denying his own blood to protect an arrangement did not sit easily with people who'd built their own reputations on exactly that kind of loyalty. Betsy stood beside him through all of it, not saying much, because she didn't need to. Her presence, and the boy standing quietly at her side, said what 6 years of denial had tried to erase. By the end of the evening, the marriage arrangement Youngja had spent months constructing had quietly fallen apart, the family on the other side unwilling to attach themselves to a situation that had just been aired in front of half the people whose opinions mattered most to them. It wasn't the kind of justice that came with police or courtrooms. It was the kind that mattered most in the world Doyun had grown up in. Reputation, undone in public, by his own choice rather than someone else's exposure. Rex, who had been brought along and kept near the door, broke away one more time that night, walking straight past everyone else in the room to settle at the boy's feet, the way he apparently should have been allowed to 6 years earlier. The months after the gathering weren't simple, and Betsy never let herself pretend they would be. Youngja didn't disappear from their lives overnight, and the family's response to what had happened at that dinner played out slowly, in the quiet loss of alliances that had once been guaranteed, in conversations Betsy wasn't part of but heard about secondhand. But Doyun didn't waver the way he had 6 years earlier. He'd made his choice in front of the people whose opinions used to control him, and he kept making it, day after day, in smaller ways that mattered more than the public moment had. He moved closer to where Betsy and the boys lived, not into their home, not right away, but close enough to be part of their daily life, instead of a distant, occasional presence. He learned Elias liked to be the one to feed Rex in the mornings, and Micah liked to be the one to walk him, and he built his schedule around those small routines instead of expecting his sons to build their lives around his. Betsy watched him earn back trust in ways money never could have bought 6 years earlier, one ordinary afternoon at a time. She didn't rush what she felt about him. She let it move at whatever pace it needed to, and for the first time in a long while, nobody was pressuring her to move faster than that. Youngja, in the end, didn't become a warm presence in her grandsons' lives, not quickly, not easily. But she came to one of their birthdays eventually, standing a little apart from everyone else, watching Rex chase the boys around the yard, with an expression that looked almost like regret. It was a small thing. Betsy decided it was enough to leave the door open, without deciding yet how far she'd let it open. The organization's business went on, the way those things do, but Do-yoon's place within it changed. He stopped being a man who let silence make decisions for him. He started making sure that whatever came next in that family's future, his sons would never again exist as a complication someone else got to resolve on his behalf. Betsy, for her part, stopped waiting for someone to apologize for the years she'd spent carrying a secret alone. She'd built a life without anyone's help once. Now she was building a different one, on her own terms, with people in it who'd finally chosen to stay. If you made it this far, you already know this wasn't really a story about a dog. It was about what happens when the truth outlasts the lie built to bury it, and what it costs, and what it's worth, to finally choose the people you should have chosen the first time. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's another one coming soon that I think you're going to need.